Yeah, anytime you're ready.
So, Fred, we want to start at the very beginning. What year were you born, and where?
Now we're talking about ancient times now. I was born in Brooklyn. That eventually became a Hasidic part of New York, Brooklyn, in 1919. And my dad was a dentist, and he did, very, very well. We owned a big apartment house, 5 stores. So I grew up, not only in that kind of atmosphere. By that I mean, upper middle class wealth sort of thing. But he was also a great intellect. And I haven't mentioned, it's very important that I mention my dad, because of all the people in my life, there are always few people here and there, but he, I believe, was the central figure of what it is that I think I've become. However you may take that. But he was the kind of a guy who was known in Yiddish as the Stille Gewehr. A Stille Gewehr means somebody who is very wealthy, but he's also a radical. Stille means silent, Gewehr means rich man. Stille Gewehr. Because he was an out-and-out Marxist and a Spinozist. He loved Spinoza and Marx. And so I grew up in that atmosphere, really, of intellect, of discussion, and so on.
And where was his family from?
From Russia, I think it was Slitska Gubernnia. Another reason why it's very important, this is something I've never talked about ever in all the interviews I've ever done. When the Soviet Union was really getting on its way to being what was known as Soviet Union, my dad wanted to leave America and live in Soviet Union. He wrote a letter to a guy named, all of these things are coming back to me now. He wrote a letter to a guy named Troyanevsky. He was ambassador from the Soviet Union to America. Troyanevsky and my father were very dear friends, fighting in the underground against the Tsar. They were like spies against the Tsar, that kind of thing. And I remember we got together in the kitchen, and he said, "Listen, children, I want to go to Soviet Union because that's where my heart is," and so on. And he wrote this incredibly lovely letter in Russian. He was, and Abe, my brother Abe, had in fact a Mozart mentality. He was incredibly brilliant musician. And another one, very important influence in my life, my brother, my father. And he gets a letter back. He says, "Dear comrade," Hyman is named after him. "Dear comrade Hyman," he said, "because of the fact that you knew certain people that have been executed, against, because they were against Stalin," he said, "we cannot accept you at all." And I'll never forget how crestfallen he was. He was really, we probably would have been gone, we would all have been dead by now, because of what happened. But that was one of the first blows that I ever got. That suddenly my father became a real figure. You know what I mean? And Troyanevsky wrote this very lovely letter, as "Dear comrade," and so on. It would not be good politics for you to go. And so I grew up with, my dad was a great believer in Spinoza. I remember coming home from a gig. I used to play weddings, chasanas, bar mitzvahs, whatever. And I remember he was sitting at the kitchen table reading Spinoza. And by the way, that's not light summer reading, you know that. I mean, here is Spinoza. And he says, I still know what the hell does he mean by substance? I never forget that. Just that one word drove him crazy. What does he mean by substance, and so on? Well, that was the atmosphere. And but my dad also wanted, and this is maybe related more to me, he wanted all the children, Abe and Stanley, my brothers, to be musicians. Because his dream was that we should get together as we get older to play together Beethoven trios, which we did. And I remember them sitting there, because we lived very well, and here we were, the only real radicals in the whole neighborhood was us, and we had the most money. Money had nothing to do with it. And this is very important to me. As a kid, what is important is compassion. If you have compassion, you will be right. Whatever you have to do, everything stems from a love of the fellow human being. And by the way, he also studied to be a rabbi too, but he gave that up. But that never left me, because sometimes when I look at the political situation today, I say, now why would a guy think like that? Like for example, I hate to bring it politically, but voting against, let's say, the extension of unemployment. Why would they do that? They have no compassion. They don't give a damn about people. They only give about themselves. And I'm not trying to be ideological now. I couldn't care less about that. But what was missing is a real feeling for the human being. And that has never left me. No matter where I go ideologically, I can never lose the idea that, because my dad once said to me, because people say, why are you a Marxist, a communist, so on. And he said to me, it's not because of us, because we're doing well. He said, it's because of him. How is he doing? And he used to go around with baskets of food with my wife. My wife used to work for him. She was his nurse. Baskets of food, and leave it on people's step that were very poor. They go way the hell out of the way and then run away so nobody would know where the food came from. When you grow up in that kind of an atmosphere, you cannot be a right-wing Republican. You just can't. You know what I mean? And so that really is probably the beginning of my life, my father.
And did you grow up it was an English-speaking household, or was there some Yiddish spoken?
Yiddish. So, mostly English, because my dad spoke English. He was a grammarian in English. He was really quite an extraordinary guy. But my mother mostly spoke a combination of Yiddish and English. Yeah.
And where was her family from?
Also from the same city, where it might have been Slutska, I think. Either that or Vilna. There was one or the other. Vilna became a very important center, I understand, later on. Yeah.
And your father also held what we might call salons at the house. Is that correct, when you were growing up?
What do you mean by salon?
Like salons, like a little... Oh,
salon. Oh, yes, of course.
Gathering.
Yeah. Well, that's where the good old word saloon comes from. He would, every once in a while, he would dress up like they did in old Russia, with a very colored shirt, with a little rope around it, and he'd play the balalaika. And I remember sitting in a corner listening to this music. He wasn't a great musician, but whatever he played came from the heart, And eventually he started to study. Here's an instrument maybe that you don't even hear about anymore, concertina. Because it's, peasant instrument. But I do remember this. You may use this or not if you want to. But he used to have people come over the house, those old friends from the old Russian days. And some of them became a little, today it's called conservative. In those days it was called reactionary. But they were still socialists. See, there was right-wing socialists, left-wing socialists, right-wing communists, left-wing, it was that sort of thing. And he used to come over the house, and my mother would make the peasant fare of fried herring and boiled potatoes, which I do not expect you to eat at all. Fried herring and boiled potatoes, that was the thing. And to sit around talking about everything from music to politics to love to Spinoza. There's a few of his friends, all, bright people, most of them working in the garment industry. And so they were talking about, freedom in America, this and that and so on. And I remember, and this is another incident that is always implanted in my mind. There's a little guy sitting there who went through the wars, who really fought against the Tsar, was beaten brutally, and a good old-fashioned guy was willing to give his life, and he almost did. He was sitting there, and they're talking about freedom in America, all those little cliches and so on. And he said, listen, comrades, he said, the day when there is a movement that would threaten capitalism, you will be surprised how dictatorial this country will be. And later on, that proved to be in the Vietnam War. Remember the brutality against those kids? In Chicago, they beat those kids almost half to death. Some of the kids are still in hospital. Can you imagine? I mean, and I forgot that. And maybe every system is like that. There's a certain place where you cannot go. You know what I mean? So those are the influence. And then, of course, music was always in the house. Always in the house. I mean, remember in those days, the pop star was Enrico Caruso, the greatest, the great opera star. That's what I mean. Joshua, my God, in radio in those days when it first got started, I remember Joshua Heifetz used to play on a radio show, and one day I remember we had what was called one of the best radios of his day, called the Stromberg Carlson. You talk about things that I remember. Stromberg Carlson, and the entertainment for that evening was, you ready for this? George Bernard Shaw gave a lecture on old radio, and all the people, everybody, all the neighborhood would sit around listening to George Bernard Shaw on old radio. Those days they didn't have commercials, so so that also gave me a kind of think about that. From the beginning, the pristine beginning is always good. Then something happens to it. You know what I mean? Because what is it? DeForest, the one who invented the television tube, he said that if I had known what they did to my invention, I would have strangled it in its crib. Those are the things that are, and they never leave me. They're always with me. Anyway.
And do I have it correct that among the people in the neighborhood who would come to those gatherings was somebody who would later on become a very famous jazz singer? Tony Bennett?
Tony, I met Tony in the war, during the Second World War. So this is way after. Let me see. I'll be as brief as I can because it's a little long story. I was in the army. I was a medic. After the war, before the E-Day, before Japanese Day, somehow I found myself being musical director of the 7th Army. I had no rank. I was a goddamn private. That's all. It's to this day I don't understand that. And they gave me a beautiful house in what was the name of that town where they had this great big castle? I forget right now. But so I was like a big shot but with no rank. And what I did, I was write music over and over again for what they call soldiers shows. Actors and actresses would come over and so on and so on. This might interest some musicians out there. So when I came into this house, there was a lieutenant there who was a trumpet player. So there was no problem of rank and whatever. He was a lieutenant and so on. He was a groovy guy. And he said, listen, I want you to write some arrangements. Some people are coming to entertain the soldiers. Now, I never wrote an arrangement in my life, ever, because now I'm an old hat at that now. But I never wrote an arrangement, and I didn't know what the ranges were of a saxophone. What is the lowest note, what is the highest note? It would never occur to me, So I wrote a series of arrangements anyway, what I thought would be very nice. It turned out okay. But I remember one of the guys was playing, he says, the soldiers were musicians, like everybody else. Said, hey, man, this note ain't on the saxophone, man. So I said, well, you see, that's the trouble with copyists. I got out of it that way. Then I said, what note, and I got figured out. And I used to go out to all the people in that Strasbourg. It was a thing called Strasbourg Village. They all had jazz records. They loved American jazz, and I used to listen to it by the hour. Now, during those days, in comes a group of people, and Tony was one of them. You see. Now, in those days, to this day, I still call him Joe because he used to go under the name of Joe Barry. Joe Barry. So he came in, and he was ordinary guy and so forth, and somehow involved that he was like a singer. So I wrote arrangements for him with this orchestra, and we hit it off very, very well, and we were friends for a long, long time. And then we parted, but how we parted is another story. But that's how I met. And then we were very, very close friends after the war, too. And then as he began to become part of the popular world, and I was part of the classical world, and somehow we didn't mix together. But he was over the house about a year ago. And but whatever magic we had, it was not there anymore. There's something about big fame that changes a person. I don't know who that. I don't give a damn who you are. When you have that kind of fame, people, nobody's really written about it. Something happens to the person. All of a sudden, the gentle teasing that we used to have, all of that was gone. We were discussing what he loves. He's a very talented painter. Joe is a very gifted artist. We discussed art. You know what I mean? In other words, we were trying to find something that we could talk about without having the fun that they used to have. That changed. You see what I mean? So yeah, that was the last time I saw him. We had a very nice afternoon. It was very gentle, very quiet, but without the fun and the magic that musicians should have together.
So going back to the early days, could you tell us about when you started playing cello and what your early years in the classical world were like?
My dad wanted me to be a musician, and Abe, was wound up as a trumpet player at the Metropolitan Opera. Stanley became a very fine violinist, who later became a dermatologist. I miss those guys very, very deeply because we were, you talk about enmity among siblings. We had none of that. None of that. When we got together, it was a ball. It was a picnic. It was fun. It was a million laughs and so on. What was the question? I'm sorry.
When you first started playing cello in the early classical years.
I first started when I think I was 9 or 10 years old. I played piano. I started as a pianist. And in those days, there were two women who were considered the greatest teachers of piano for young children. They probably still sell the books now today. So my dad took me to play for them. I was 9 years old. And I played, and can you believe this? I remember to this day. Da 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 da. Da 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 da. I remember. To this day, I remember that. And the woman, what was her name? I forget her first name. Elizabeth, I think was her name. And she patted my head. I think these things stay with you. She said, "You're a little angel." I remember that. You're a little angel. And I played piano. And then and I started to become really, pretty good as a pianist. And then my dad brought home a saxophone or a violin, and neither one of which I really enjoyed playing. But the one thing about that, my grandfather, Jacob, was a great, great, great guy. He used to practice with me. He was a violinist. So I remember that we would play scales together. That's the kind of atmosphere. And then one day, he brought home a cello, and I took to that thing like I was born in the crib with it. And then at the age of 15, I played at town hall the Son cello concerto. It was after about 2 or 3 years of of study. Literally, I mean, it was like, I remember, by the way, yes, I want to correct something now, right now, as long as you're here. I never studied with Casals. I meant to talk about it last, but I forgot. I studied with a famous disciple of Casals, and I keep saying that to everybody, but they keep making the same mistake. And I mean, it would have been a great honor, to put it mildly, to study with Casals. But Razanov was his name. He was a wonderful man, and he played beautiful cello. And so I studied with him, and he was Casals' favorite disciple, and so on. I forget now what the hell the point of this was.
And like, for how long were you playing purely classical before you started moving into the jazz world?
A long, long time. Jazz to me was something I was, it was very interesting listening to. It didn't really mean that much to me. But then I remember Lily and I used to go out at nighttime. We used to visit probably the greatest mecca of jazz was 57th Street in New York City. Now get this, you guys. On one side of the street, as long as you could see, were jazz clubs. On the other side of the street, right across the street, was jazz clubs. I mean, you're talking about 20, 25 jazz clubs. It was unreal. I mean, those days have gone forever. And I remember we went to one place, and of course, I was open for anything. I come from that kind of family. Whatever the experience it, what I mean. So we went there, and there was wonderful jazz players. And I remember saying to Lil, where is the music? They didn't have, they didn't have any music. They played standards, one after the other. I said, I got to learn how to do that. I really got to learn how to do that, And there was a program on WNYC, New York City, that a little jazz program. And the guy, I forget his name, but he was wonderful, very, very kind, intelligent guy about jazz and classical music and so on. And whatever he said, I used to absorb like a sponge. And then I started to play piano. When I started to, work as bar mitzvahs or weddings, I would fool around and improvise. And boy, that was as we used to say, that was a gas. To be able to play what the hell ever you want to play and don't worry about it, you know what I mean? And of course, quite different from the classical. I mean, you play Mozart, Beethoven, Brahms, Bach, you don't change any notes, man. You play, and now suddenly the notes come from you. It's from your own soul. I mean, that. I wish people would try to really understand that, because when a jazz guy plays, he's going on an adventure. Where is he going? I have no idea. You know what I mean? And if the audience would learn to go with him, that I've talked about that a couple of times when I used to teach at Cal State, that if the audience would learn to really listen to jazz as it is evolving from the player, then they're both enjoying the journey together. You see what I mean? So I began to play jazz, and skipping a lot of years now, somehow I got involved with, I got to play behind Lena Horne as part of a string quartet. In those days they had vaudeville. They had a motion picture, and then they had a live entertainment. You see what I mean? And they used to have animal trainer, magician, tap dancer, and then the star. You know what I mean? So I guess I should tell you this story because it's changed my life, really. So I'm playing strictly classical cello. Now, there was an arrangement that she did called Frankie and Johnny. We all know the tune. Frankie and Johnny were lovers. Nobody knew who was the masculine in this thing. Who was, sounds like a homosexual relationship, Frankie and Johnny. But Frankie was the lady. But anyway, so it was a 7-minute or 8-minute arrangement. Now, this is, the guy who wrote the arrangement was Phil Moore. I have never gotten over his expertise is a bad word, but his musicianship and craft He was magnificent writer. And in it there was a little stop, and Alina used to be in front of the curtain one, and she would react to the music. No singing. It was a very, very avant-garde thing. She just, with her beautiful voice and beautiful face and figure, all of that. And so she would just react to the music. Now, at that point, Phil Moore wrote a little cello cadenza. You know what a cadenza is? It's a little solo piece. So, and I played it and so forth. So I'm skipping things, but this is the essential thing. At that moment, oh yes, then there was a cast party. It was one of those things. So Miss Lena Horn comes over to me and said, I was in awe of her because she was such a great performer, great star. I think probably the greatest nightclub performer ever lived. And she came over and said, I want to thank you for that lovely solo. You really play it beautifully, and it really helps me. I mean, that's Lena Horn said that to me. I said, thank you very much, and so on. Now we were going to in the cast party, and they had, food laid out, sandwiches, so no road luck, unfortunately, but that, whatever, so on. And they had a piano. So because I really didn't know too much of anything, I sat down and started to play the piano. And I had plenty of facility, and I played some standards because I love jazz that much, but I never played it as a living. 2 or 3 weeks later, I get a call from, this changed my whole life about the jazz stuff. I got a strict, okay. I get a call from the manager, I think his name is Nat Devin, who, by the way, really helped Tony Bennett to go where he eventually became. Because Nat Devin used to listen to him and said, you got to do ballads. Tony loved to sing scat music. Tony is a wonderful scat singer. He's never done that, in public. But he got wonderful, as we call in music, he got wonderful ears. He really hears very well. And Nat Devin is the one who said, you got to do it, it's okay. And then Mitch Miller heard of Tony, and that was the beginning of his career. So anyway, I say thank you very much. I play the piano, and I get this call. Would you like to go on the road with Lena Horn? I said, well, of course. I was all right. Now comes an interesting moment. There was a jazz pianist. You probably remember his name, Jerry Wiggins. You ever heard of Jerry? Jerry was playing piano for her. They rented a little room in Carnegie Hall, a little room, and they had two grand pianos there. And they wanted to hear how I would play in competition with Jerry Wiggins. Okay, because they wanted to know really if I knew, if I could play, but I had the technique. But the jazz chops came later. You know what I mean? So what did we start out with? The only tune that I knew then was T for Two. That's it. So we started to play T for Two, and we're improvising like crazy and so forth. And improvise against Jerry was murderous because he was, a really authentic, terrific jazz player. And by the way, one of the nicest human beings on the face of the earth. He died, a few years ago. I love Jerry very dearly. He's a wonderful guy. And apparently they were satisfied. So I went on the road. Now, who was playing drum for her? This is exactly not what you're talking about. Chico Hamilton. You see? So after the gig was over, I had to come to LA for some reason. I don't remember now. That eludes me. But I remember Chico. Oh yes, I know. I was playing for a girl, a woman named Jana Mason, who we're still very friends to this very day. And we played the Macambo Club. So I played piano for her. I used to coach music. That's another part of my life that you don't have to know about. And I used to play piano for her, coach her, write arrangements, all of that stuff. And now we're looking for a drummer. I said, maybe Chico Hamilton is not busy. I called him up. I said, hey, Chico, would you like? Yeah, he said, I'm sure, any kind of a gig. So we played behind Johnny Mason, all the arrangements. Now, one day we're sitting at the bar, although I don't drink, but that's my problem. But he says, Chico said, he just left Lena. He says, I'd like to form a little jazz group, but I need a different kind of an instrument. See? It never occurred to me in a million years that I would be playing jazz cello. Never. And that's, as I say, that's why I pointed to that first album. That was the first time I played jazz on the cello. So I said, and he said, I want. So he settled on a guy by the name of, I forget his last name. John was his first name. He said, I think I'll work with a French horn player. We're just talking, about forming a group. We're a different kind of a jazz player. Okay, I say, fine. And what the devil was his second name? I forgot his name now. It'll come to me eventually. So he was going to do that. 2 weeks later, or 3 weeks later, he died. A young man died. So Chico and I were talking. We met again. I said, Chico, how about the idea of maybe a cello? Never thinking of myself at all. I was, He said, that's not a bad idea. We met at Chico's house in L.A. Buddy Collette was there. Now, Buddy Collette, I knew, was one of the great jazz players in the business. And he comes in, this tall, wonderful-looking guy with the saxophone and the clarinet and the flute. Every instrument he played magnificently well. So he said, bring the cello. So I brought the cello. And I said, so he said, let's see how it sounds together with the flute, with the, So the only tune I knew then on the cello, because I loved the tune, was Funny Valentine. And eventually that became my signature tune. Everywhere I go, I had to play Funny Valentine. Okay. So I played it, and I remember Chico say, hey, Chico might say, hey, that sounds nice. I think, so we formed the group. That's the beginning of my jazz. That's the story of that.
For you,
there are all kinds of stories in between, but you don't have to know all of that.
For you, what's your sense of why the Chico Hamilton group was so important to the development of jazz?
Well, I can talk about that for a long time. Let's see if I can condense it down to 3 hours. The reason why is, first of all, we were formed originally not as Chico Hamilton. The idea was to find a name that fit 5 guys. Then we were talked about it. I said, no, it's better that we had a name to it. It would be more commercial that way. It would sell better. So that's why we thought of the idea of Chico Hamilton Quintet. The reason why all the music, most of the music came from each individual writer. So Buddy Collette, who was a wonderful, wonderful composer, forget his jazz chops. He wrote a thing called A Nice Day. I started with the cello, da 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 da, very classical, and then it turns into a lovely little, that sort of a jazz thing. It was just that set the tone of the Chico Hamilton Quintet. Jimmy Hall, who played guitar, was also not only a wonderful player, but also a wonderful composer. So everything we did, we wrote for us. So we would write some jazz things, and then because I was the classical guy, the classical wise guy, I started to write classical music to be played by jazz players. So the big thing I wrote was The Sage. Remember, there's no jazz in that. It's all written out. You know what I mean? You had to play it. It was written, but to play with the feeling of a sort of a jazz nocturne. And The Sage, of course, was named after my father. But and so then we began to experiment one night in this place called Strollers in Long Beach. where the sailors and the hookers used to come. And I met some of the nicest hookers in the world, by the way. They're really very interesting kids. I really adore them. They were very interesting people. And we started to play, and oh yes, we played. Right, I'm trying to remember now. We played, and then it was like intermission. Okay. Now in those days I used to play on piano and cello in the group. I would sit on the piano and then wheel around and play the cello. Eventually that got to be unwieldy, so we decided to leave the piano alone, so we don't have to worry about harmony, because harmony would be taken by the guitar. Anyway, so as we're sitting there, the guys are all going out with in the audience. I'm up there by myself, noodling around with the cello, and I just started to improvise. It was the first time I ever done that. People are watching me and so on. And I started improvising, and then I began to get lost in that. As I began to do that, the guys were listening to me playing. Chico, Buddy, Carson Smith, the bass player. That was the bass player I talked about, by the way. He died a couple of years ago. And Jimmy Hall. And they came on this thing, and Chico started like a drum thing. And that's what changed everything. We did a whole, maybe 20, 25-minute improvisation, starting from nowhere. No notes, just the feeling of each other. That, I think, helped to change the whole idea of the jazz experience, where you don't have to play standards or even have to write anything. And that's what we used to do in nightclubs. We would start playing. It's on a record, too. I forget the name of the record now. But we would start playing in a nightclub, where they used to jazz and blah, 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 blah. And all of a sudden, we would start very quietly, and Chico would start with the drum. And we got involved with, sound like Stravinsky. I don't know what the hell we did, but it was just incredible. That idea has never really been done by a group of 5 guys. Okay, the writing, and of course the playing, the fact that the writing was as jazz as, as much whatever the jazz may mean to you, and the fact that I helped, write some of the, like Lord Randall, which was maybe a 10-minute piece, but all classical, no jazz to it. They used to play it in a nightclub, and people would listen to, what is that? What is that? You see what I mean? Yeah. So I think it was a combination of all those things, and also the fact is, we were featured in the picture with Burt Lancaster, Sweet Smell of Success. And that was the first time, I think, that jazz was used as a score behind action in the movies. So it was a combination of all those things. You see what I mean? And then Buddy wrote some very interesting things he wrote a piece called Buddy Boo, which we used to play and so on. But the big thing was that we would just sit down and play anything we wanted to play, and because we knew each other. And the other thing is this: when you do an improvisation like that, where it comes from nowhere, the biggest thing is to know to stop playing, let someone else play, and listen to each other. And that's what we did. And because of that, I think that we were, to this very day, if you listen to some of the stuff that we did in 1958, 59, for God's sake, the album that I wrote was in 1957, right, Josh? Yeah, 57. Imagine how, and now it's being recognized. The reviews I've been getting, and I think it's been unbelievable. It's like I wrote the reviews myself. It's unreal. But I mean, for me, it wasn't the idea of being ahead of the time. I never thought about that. It was a good idea to try it, see what happens. And so that the improvisation that came out of our group really related to each individual personality. And then because of the writing, which was very unusual for the 5 guys to do writing in a group, and each individual writing was special, I think all of those things made us a really important group. I think to this very day, I think we're still influencing people.
Could you tell us a little about the history of one of the records you did together, which was the Zen album, which featured your music?
Yeah. Well, I began to study Buddhism then, still very much involved with that now. We were then working for World Pacific, and we did a couple of albums, and we did well, and all that kind of thing. And then Dick Park, who died way before his time, came over to me and said, Fred, I want you to do an album of your own music. It was just simple like that. So, okay, and it really was there. So, what did I do? I think, didn't I write like a little piece for Paul Horn, a concerto, a suite for horn? Isn't that the one? Yeah. Now, that was never done before. The idea of doing, a classical piece for a jazz man, and so on. And the idea for picking a title, Dick's, we were talking about that. I said, Dick, I'm studying Zen. He said, that's it, Zen. And the guy who took a pic, the reason I'm looking around, I think there was a thing about famous jazz people. I think I'm in one of these books or whatever. But the guy who took a picture of the cover of Zen, if you take a look at it, I can't find it right now, became eventually a very big Hollywood director. That in those days he was doing photos for the 78s, where you had a lot larger thing, a larger canvas to do it. And he took a picture of Chico, myself, and Paul Horn standing in front of a pond. The only thing is that he turned it around so that what you're really looking at is our reflection in the pond. That's why it has that sort of unearthly feeling, you see. So one side was classical, the suite for horn, and I think we did. I really don't remember now. I think we did Lord Randall, which created. I think I created a star because that was never done to be treated like that. On the other side, I wrote jazz things. Carson Smith wrote a wonderful piece for me called Katz. Because he, right. So, but that's really the basis of Zen. The other thing I wanted to tell you about, because it's related to that, Chico or somebody got a call from George Avakian. George Avakian was head of Columbia Records in those days. He said, I'd like Fred, this is what they told me, I'd like Fred to do a piece for my wife. His wife was a violinist. So I wrote this piece, and I called it Concerto Petite, featuring her playing the violin and accompanied by the Chico Hamilton Quintet. That was never done before, to this day, as far as I know. And and the only place where you can hear it is on a thing called Mosaic Records. It was recorded at that. We did a town hall thing, and it was recorded, which was, I didn't know about that. They recorded it without me knowing about it, and then they included it in this Mosaic Record. But it's a very interesting. She's playing strictly classical, and we got a little jazz motifs going behind her. So I call that jazz. But that again, I think that probably did influence a couple of people. At least I think so.
For you, is there a particular relationship between Buddhism and jazz? Were they two languages that spoke well to each other, or were they very separate for you?
I think they're pretty separate, sure. Yeah, and it isn't a question of saying, Buddhism is the best. I don't think that way. All religions. What was it? During the Renaissance, they used to say, the words are wonderful, the actions are not. And it's still true to this very day. So I began on the road. Of course, you're alone, and I wasn't a womanizer. That was not my thing. I wanted to read, and I always used to read voraciously. I was like a sponge. And I got this little book on Zen. And then I influenced Paul Horn then eventually Paul Horn became his own master. Paul is a master now today, but not in Zen, but in Hinduism. And so I remember we were playing a place in Chicago, a very, very fancy, ritzy restaurant, very fancy schmancy restaurant. I haven't used that word in a long, fancy schmancy. And we were then, pretty big shot guy. So Chico said, all of a sudden the announcer, now ladies and gentlemen, we'll do a composition by Freddie Katz called Zen. And I wasn't prepared to play Zen in a restaurant, you know what I mean? Because it was all classical and very strange and all of that kind of thing. As we said that, suddenly a guy sitting, I remember this very day, I was a cello here, guy sitting right there, all of a sudden he does like that, so on. So we got through with the piece. He asked me to come over with Paul. He was a Zen monk. And he said to Paul, and Paul later on told me, he said, that's not really Zen music. And he was probably right. I don't know what Zen music is, And I wrote it for Paul. That was the second movement of the concerto for the Suite for Horn, because I wrote it for clarinet, and it really is a very lovely piece, I think. So those influences, I still think maybe of influence, because I'm trying to answer your question about the influencing. I think those are the things I think that permeated. That's why when they announced my name that night and this roar came up, so who are these people that remember me? I mean, you have no idea. That shook me up. And it was interesting, that got rid of my nervousness in the flesh. I was like this inside, because I hadn't played in public in maybe 20 years. Years ago, I used to play public. Didn't mean it, it's another gig, but I was really beside myself with nervousness. Okay. But when they started to applaud and yell and scream for it, I said, who are these people that never know of me? You know what I mean? To this day, I'm still a little bit not quite sure, but maybe there's another guy named Fred Katz. I don't know. It just didn't make sense to me. Because I lived this very quiet, insular life here. All my people have died. And my daughter is dying too at this moment. So my life is very quiet and very meditative and so on. But I came to Zen Buddhism on the road because I wanted to read something else with that, and I was very influenced by Alan Watts, who wrote about Zen to this very day. And because and it isn't a question, as I said before, to sort of sum it up, not because it's a religion. To me, I'm sure it is to everybody. It's because it's a philosophy. It's a way of looking at life. There's no mention of God in Buddhism at all. They used to call it the atheistic religion, No mention of God. It's something else. And that has helped me a great deal. At the same time, I really respect all religions. Why? Because the impulse is right. What they do with that impulse is another matter. Just like socialism is right. What they did with it and distorted it, like Stalin did, is a crime beyond belief. You know what I mean? Yeah. So Buddhism has become but I've never written anything related to Buddhism. If I did write what I'm working now, it's always related to my early roots, my Jewish roots. I find it when I'm playing, some of those Hebraic modes, I'm really transported into another world. Every morning I get up. Normally by now I would have been playing a couple of pieces by now. But when I get up in the morning and just by myself, before I even eat breakfast, I'm playing a little Hebraic melody, and I'm transported into another world, But I've always had those Jewish Hebraic roots, but my life took a form of not denial, but interested more in the political. Like Karl Marx said, Karl Marx started out with the idea of how do we get rid of an alienation. That really was his first idea. How do we get rid of this alienation going on? And then he came to the idea, the theory of dialectical material, all of that stuff. But anyway, so Buddhism has helped me, not in the sense that I'm a Buddhist, but I practice what might be considered deep meditation, philosophical ideas about what is called emptiness and so on. Am I doing something wrong? Okay. Emptiness and whatever it is. Okay.
So maybe before we take a little break, could you tell us one story that I remember that I think is before Chico, but I could be wrong.
Okay.
Is when you were doing arrangements for Carmen McCrae that were very important.
Yeah, that happened after Chico. No, that happened during Chico. Yeah, I got a call from Decca Records. They I wrote some stuff. They wanted me to go to New York, and I remember this. Milt Gabler was the president of Decca then, and I wrote some music that they liked, and I was a new guy in the block, and so on. And we went to have coffee at DuPont's, where a lot of the business thing took place, a cup of coffee. So. And he says to me, "Listen, Fred, I'm going to open up an office in New York City. I'd like you to be one of the directors, a producer, director, that sort of thing." Well, I was interesting, because I could use the money. I was making very little money, Okay, it's fine. And then he said something to me. He said, "You'll have to get involved with rock and roll." And then I said to Milton, I was created by God not to do rock and roll. And he said, "All right, I understand." And that was it. And I never regret it. But I was then involved with Chico. I was then playing with Chico because I was so happy playing. We were playing in little jazz clubs and so on. But it was wonderful. I think I was making $70 a week then. But it was great. Lillian, of course, went along with it because whatever made me happy made her happy, and whatever made her happy made me happy. I got the call to do an album for Carmen. Now, this is going to maybe surprise a lot of people, particularly musicians maybe. I never met Carmen for the album, never. She sent me lead sheets. Lead sheet is music and the chords, that's all, just basic skeleton things. On the road, I did the whole album. I never met her. The only time I met her was the actual session, maybe months later. She didn't know what I was going to write. I had no idea what else she was going to sing. But I kind of, because I respected Carmen as she started out as a pianist, She was a good piano player, what the guys tell me. But I respected her. I know she got good ears, and so I wrote all kinds of, crazy little things. And she loved it. She absolutely loved it. But I never, when you arrange for somebody, you usually meet with them. I never met her. Never. Except for the recording. But it worked. But it never occurred to me that it worked. I knew it would work because I know my craft. You know what I mean? If you know your craft, you can do anything. So, and then she called me about a year and a half later, maybe. I lived in Sherman Oaks then. I was doing very well then. I was Hollywood. It was all blah, blah, blah. Didn't mean that much. But I was living in this lovely home and all of that. And she called me up. And I understand from what the other guys told me, that was very unusual for her to do that. She was very hard on musicians. But not with me, because I was, I was the conductor, the arranger, so whatever. One of the last pieces, I forget the name of it, the night they called it a day, I came in with the cello. She didn't know about that. She flipped. "Oh my God, Freddie!" So I played the cello and so forth. She just loved it. And then she called me about a year and a half later to tell me, she said, Fred, of all the albums I've done, that was absolutely the most creative I've ever done. Now, follow this story. I get a call maybe a year later after that. I don't remember exactly the timing of it. The guy from Chicago, a music teacher. He said, Fred, I just listened to the arrangements of you did for Carmen, and I want to teach arranging based upon your scores. You know what I mean? You know what I mean by score? Music written out for everybody. So he said, because of what you did, is so wonderful and all of that. Okay. So I call up Carmen. I don't remember how I got a number, but I had a number. And I explained to her what happened. That the guy wants to teach the students arranging based upon what I wrote for her and so on. She became what we used to call in jazz salty. When you become salty, you become a little bit angry, or difficult to get along with. Salty. That's where you get that tune. I could cry salty tears. That's where that phrase comes from. I could cry. So, and she said, I bought that music and I'm not giving it away to anybody. I said, come on, Carmen. She would not give it away to this very day. Her estate has all those arrangements. Those arrangements have become icons. I understand. People study it, and because I wrote three different kinds. I wrote for strings, I wrote for woodwinds, and I wrote for brass. That was the first time that was done, for a singer. So I gave her three different sounds to relate to. And the people were telling me when they did a book on Tony, the guy told me, he said, I just went, well, of course, to ask me about Tony Bennett, about what he did and so on. And he said that, your arrangements have become iconic, so on using it. But I could, somewhere in her state are all those arrangements, and I've never seen it since. And she would not release it. Yeah.
Can we talk about some of the solo albums you did that you led? The Fred Katz and his Jammers. Can we start with that album?
Yeah, that's right there.
Yeah.
Yeah.
About what year was that roughly?
Let me think. 59, 60 maybe, I think.
And what was the story with that album cover?
Oh. I did one of the things that I did there. I featured a very, very fine bass player named Leroy Vinegar. I don't know whether you remember him, but he was a wonderful, wonderful player. And his manager was a lovely lady who pleaded with me that I should do something because I was, I did a lot of things, so they wanted me to be involved with him. So I love Leroy's playing. I found out later on that he was not a reader of music. What he reads is chord symbols. So I wrote, but I didn't know that. So I wrote out parts for him to play because he said, "Man, I don't really read," so I had to change anyway. But that's not important. But he was a wonderful player, and let me see. So I just decided to do things I like to do. I don't even remember what I did. I don't know. I think I wrote a thing called Dixie. Why not? Because I love Dixieland very much, and so I wrote a thing called Dixie. Why not? You know what I mean? What the hell else did I wrote? I wrote a couple of things there, and then I think I don't sure. I'd have to take a look at the album. I don't remember. The album that I think that you should know about, the one I did with Sidney Poitier, about Plato philosophy. I think it's there, isn't it? There. I think it's there, right there. Yeah, there's the thing I did with him. But yeah, so I did the album, and it was in the, what they call, it's in the can. And then I get a call from Decca. Uh, we're going to take pictures of you in Malibu. And that particular day, I had a cold. It was very, believe me, I didn't want to get it. So he said, put on pajamas. Do you see it there?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Put on pajamas. All right. So I hated that. Oh, God, I hated it. So I put on the pajamas, and they came for me in this limousine. And inside their limousine was this model. Very, very pretty. She's right there. And I don't think we said one word to each other. She was very hoity, the old expression hoity-toity. She was very much like that. I couldn't care less. And we went to Malibu, and that's Malibu right there where I am. And the idea was for me to put this cello in the sand, but the sand kept going down, because it's a big point there. So we put a rock there to stop the point from going. And she's there doing posing and everything, everything. I hated that day. I was sneezing and carrying on. But and then later on I found out it's Katz in his jammers. Yeah, because jamming means playing. So that's, but I don't remember. There might be one or two things in there that were a little bit different. There's so many things. There's one piece that I wrote that Paul and I very, very close. And I read in a newspaper during Christmas, a little boy looking out the window, very poor, very poverty-stricken kid, looking out the window, hoping for presents. Yeah. And the presents never came. I wrote a piece about that. A strictly classical piece. And Paul loved it, not only, hopefully because it was good, but more important than that is that it featured him playing some really, really lovely, I hope, interesting classical things for the clarinet. Because Paul is a better clarinet player than he is a flute player. I know everybody knows him as a flute player, but basically his real instrument is clarinet. I've always told him that. I always gently tease him about that too. And so on. I wrote a piece called Classical Katz, I think it's called, where I used the Passacaglia form, which is what they used to do during Bach's day, 8 measures and so. But anyway, he and I just a duet, cello and clarinet, and that's the piece we played for Piatigorsky, and he loved it because there's a lot of cello work there and a lot of piano and so on. But that's all. That was part of. I called it the toy that never was. That piece, it always bothered me that the critics, who've been pretty good to me, and so on, didn't really catch on to really what the hell I was really doing. I don't know, because I never used anybody to sell myself. I don't believe in that. I just don't do that. I don't know why it bothered me, but a lot of people told me, yeah, you got to do this, you got to do that. We used to have in those days an agent. They used to call an agent. This is a Yiddish word, a tumula. A tumula means somebody that creates a disturbance. He creates a tumult. See, right? He's the one that tells everybody how wonderful his client is. He said, that's what you need, a tumula. But I never believed that. For some reason or other, I didn't believe it. But there are the piece that I wrote, the Concerto Petite, the toy that never was, Lord Randall, and quite a few other pieces, never really hit the critics like later on that I really hope that it should, because it created a new way of looking at jazz, really, you know. That though, I used to tell that to Lily and say, forget about it. It's all right. But the main thing for me was that I wrote it and it was played. That was the important thing.
You might be the only, or maybe one of the only, recorded jazz musicians who also had a regular gig in a monastery.
Went down the wrong channel there. Yeah, I taught. I taught it. What happened? Honestly, how did this happen? Very quickly. Oh, thank God, I got a good memory. Hyman became part of a drama group. I think he was 13 or 14. You know the story of the kid that was on this abandoned planet, written by a French writer. Zubri was his name. I forget the name of the book right now. Talking about a memory, but I forget it. And he was one of the, he was part of a group from Santa Monica or Santa Rosa, one of those groups there. And the director was talking. He took the part of the lamplighter, Hyman, my son. He wanted to be an actor, by the way. But anyway, and then later on he changed his mind. But the director said, "Listen," he said, I would like to have music for this." So Hyman said, "Oh, my father writes music." So he told him who I was. Said, "Oh my God, I would love it. I didn't know your father," and so on. So I wrote an entire musical drama for cello alone. They decided to perform this play in this monastery, St. Andrew's Monastery. And because I wrote the music, and it was rather difficult music, you know. So I played the music, and I became very well acquainted with Father Vincent, who I believe was one of the greatest, redoubtable intellects that I'd ever met in my life. We were very, very close, Father Vincent. He died a few years ago, and we were talking about this when I was doing it, and so on. So I was telling him I was teaching anthropology then, and he said, "Would you like to come?" Oh, he was a wonderful man, but I loved him very much, Father Vincent. He said, "Would you like to come and teach us about ethnic music, ethnological music?" I said, "Yeah, I guess it'd be all right, you know." So I started there, and I taught there every summer for about 13 or 14 times. And I became very well acquainted with the monks there, but all of them, they were wonderful guys. Yeah. And I remember once we were sitting around talking, we were talking and talking. And I said to, now he's a father, Father Gregory. He very easily could have been Pope. Incredible intellectual. Really, I don't think people really know that about the Catholic Church. They have a lot of intellectuals there. And I said to him I said, "Greg, what is a nice Jewish boy like me doing in a place like this?" And we became very good friends after that, you know. As a matter of fact, one of the things that brought us both to tears, I decided to surprise him one day. After I was there for at least 8 or 9 times. I taught about ethnic music, philosophy, and Kabbalah. I used to teach Kabbalah there, and they loved it. Because the reason why I was surprised, because Kabbalah teaches you that in the final analysis, there is no explanation. There's only Ein Sof, the infinite nothing. Some of the people that were there that were Catholic got very upset with that. One woman in particular, name was Mary. She was a delightful lady. She said, "How could you say that?" You know, and the guy who defended me was Father Philip, who's still there. He does all the paperwork there. Wonderful. He, by the way, loves Zen. loved Zen and Buddhism. He loved it. But you meet quite a different kind of guy than you think when you go to a monastery like that. And we became very, very close friends. And so I decided one day to bring in, the shawl that they use when they pray, the Orthodox Jews. I brought the shawl down to give it to Gregory. Gregory was, now I understand he has medical problems, but rather tall, extremely good-looking guy. By the way, fell in love with a woman, like thorn birds. That's what he went through. And I said, "What did you do, Greg?" I said, "Did you ask Jesus to help you?" I didn't mean that as a wise guy, but I just wanted to know. He said, "No, I needed a psychiatrist." And the woman, he wanted to marry her. And she said, he told me this himself. He was very open about it, so I'm telling you that now. He was very open. He told everybody about it. And she said, "No, you're much more important as a priest than as a husband." And he suffered terribly because of that. But he was a profound, to this very day. I understand he's suffering from Parkinson's now. But I got to know each one of them. One of them was a very fine flute player. And at nighttime we used to play duets for Valdi, duets, cello and flute. He went eventually to study to become a cardinal in Vatican. And I met some extraordinary people. But Philip came down for my 90th birthday. He came down, man, from this monastery in his monk's robe for my 90th birthday. And he sat there. It was a great experience. I know it was very hard for him to do that. So I was taught there. I taught the Kabbalah. They were very interested in that. I taught ethnic music. And then I also began to play, improvise. Hyman and I used to play behind dances, strictly improvisational. I remember one dancer, Carla, she said, Fred, she was a Jew who converted to Catholicism. The wonderful lady, Carla. She's a brilliant, brilliant dancer. And she said, "I want to do this dance, but it's a big wind blowing, and I don't know what to do." I said, "Carla, don't worry about it. I'll take care of that." So, "What are you going to do?" And the cello? I said, "Don't worry about it, Carla." We were very good friends. And so I did something in the cello, and she was an absolute ecstasy because it had to do with wind and flying and so on and so on. And then I started to write music for the dance troupe. And so I did that for almost, Marion, my other daughter, almost for 15 years. Every summer I went there. And then finally it got so where I said, "Listen, I'm tired of teaching." I really was. I said, "One more lecture and I'll kill myself." I was enough already. I said, "Let me play behind a dancing group." So Carla used to bring dancers, and she would dance to the scripture. And she said, "What are you going to play?" I said, "I don't know. We'll worry about it that night." So every Saturday night, instead of Vespers, we did dancing. I had no idea what was going to happen. I just played what I wanted to play. Hyman and I did that. It was magical, man. It has never reached anything. It had this little church, with the holiest place, in the Catholic Church. You may not know this, is the host. When they eat the host, and they say, "This is in the body of Jesus," and so on. That is the most holy place of all, and that's hidden away. It's locked. And I remember one day, and I mentioned this to, was it to Greg, or might have been to Philip, because Philip loved him, and I always used to question theology. We used to have a lot of fun with that. He says, "You always challenge me all the time, Fred." We were really good friends. And I remember the host is put away in a closet, and it's completely locked, because that's the body of Jesus. So I remember one day I was walking around the grounds, waiting. I was going to give a lecture about this or that and so on. And to give a lecture to those guys was not easy because these guys were very, very bright people. Very bright people. So I'm walking around, and up comes a truck, and on the truck was a legend, something bakery. You know what the bakery was? The host. I said, when did it become holy? And that's when I got into the idea of nothing is holy, you make it holy. That's something about relating to truth. Nothing is holy. Oh, then again, a famous Jewish writer said that everything is waiting to be made holy. You know? So these are little biscuits. It was made by some guy there, a bakery. When they put it in that place, it became something totally different. So what you think is truth is what you think it is, not what it is. That's a big difference there. Anyway.
So Fred, we want to ask you two final questions.
Please.
And they're a bit broader in terms of your life. When you look back over your life and all of the work you've done, is there one thing that you look back on and you feel like that's the thing you're most proud of?
Proud? One was when I gave my debut. I was a prodigy on the cello and piano both. And that's when, and I was a triple prodigy. I hate to mention this because it sounds so pompous. But I was prodigy on cello, piano, and composing. And at the age of 17 or so, I had a breakdown. But they didn't know what the hell to call it then. All I know is I was depressed, and I loved it. And the reason why, remind me about that question, because I was so depressed that I started to go to magic. I'm a magician. I'm very good with cards. That's one of the things. And that's how I got out of it. I started to read books on magic tricks and stuff, and I loved it. To this very day, I still practice magic. I love magic. That was a very, very important moment for me, learning to sitting there, figuring out. And I remember sometimes my hands would be like this. I don't understand what the hell I'm supposed to do. Drive me crazy because when you read from a book, and it gets to be very complex. But anyway, I figured it out, and I became quite good at it. Probably, I think being at the monastery and having these extraordinary intellectual guys looking at this Jewish guy, that was a very proud moment. But probably, this is going to surprise you. When I was 16, maybe 17, I was a member of the symphony orchestra called National Orchestral Association. These were young people of talent, young people of talent. So I came there and I auditioned, and they said, okay. Leon Bosman was the conductor then, a very fine conductor, and they said, okay, you can be a member of the group. So I sat in the third stand. And then I remember I used to play, sometimes I would play for people and so on. Make a long story short, there's too many things. When on the bulletin board for the beginning of the season, it had where you're going to sit. And concertmeister, the second violin. Then it came to cello. It said Fred Katz, first cello. That threw me because I never expected that to happen. I was, a young guy. So I went over to Charlie. Charlie was his name. I think he died a few years ago. I said, Charlie, I don't deserve this. I'm not that good. He said, yes, you do. Yes, you do. So I became first cellist. That was one of my great moments. Now, in the literature of classical music, Brahms wrote 2 piano concertos. The one that I'm talking about now is the B-flat one. Ba da da ba ba da ba ba. Well, anything in Brahms did this. magical to me. Now, in that concerto, there's a very long second movement featuring the cello, the first cellist, only cello. I was frightened out of my wits because it was, first of all, it had to be perfect, obviously. And secondly, the second time I come around, it's in B major, which is awkward for the cello. And I said, I don't know. I was, well, I just didn't feel I could do it. But anyway, at rehearsal, it went okay. But I know Boston was not happy with the way I was playing it. I was not smooth, he listened to it. Anyway, so I worked on it. It's a very long cello piece, just the first cellist. At the concert, I suddenly found myself, this is Carnegie Hall, and all those people are watching and everything, and the movement started, and I'm playing da 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 da, and so on. So we get through with the second movement, and that high C sharp, you have to go from here to there, because I was saying, oh my God, what happens if I miss it? I mean, that's what's going on. You know what I'm saying? What happens if I miss it? Well, I didn't miss it. I hit it okay. Now the movement ends, right? There's applause, and I'm sitting there because the pianist was getting the applause. This was a seminal moment. I know it doesn't sound like it, but it was for me. To this very day, I still think about that. I'm waiting. I'm waiting for the next movement to begin. Now I'm just part of the cello section, and so on. And the applause kept going. And finally, Bosin, who was a terrific guy, he pointed to me. He says, "That's for you. That's for you." So I was very young. And I stood up, took my bow very formally, and the audience laughed like crazy because I was so formal, like that. That was a moment I will never forget, because that was like a moment where I really had to come through with something very difficult, very classical, and it had to do not only with the fact that I could play it, but it had to be with my nerves of steel. By the way, what the people really don't know, Casals was so nervous that his hand would shake like this before he went on stage. Casals hated. Casals talk about it. So I said he hated to play in public. He was frightened to death. Heifetz too, believe it or not, Heifetz too was, his hand like this would be shaky. Perlman doesn't give a damn. Yeah, Perlman, I'll play anything. It's amazing. He just gets up and play. But I was, to this very day, God, I know how many, if I were to tell you how many concerts I've played, you can't count them. But that night, you guys, I was so nervous, I really thought I was going to die. I really did. When I started to walk with the cello and you were helping me and so forth, but when that name was mentioned and I heard that roar, I said, who are they? Is that me? I said, what did I do? You know what I mean? Then once I started to talk, I was fine. Once I started to talk, I was fine. Or to play. Once I played my first note, then I'll tell you what happened, man. I don't know whether you guys know about it. I hope you do. But when you play and have all that audience there, and suddenly you become aware of everybody looking at you, and you're playing really well, you feel like a god. I mean, you really, suddenly everything that you do, it's a special moment. Yeah, I remember that. But that was a very important moment for me. And then playing in Town Hall, where they featured my compositions that we played with Chico, that was also a very, very big moment. My parents were there, and my aunts and uncles were there, and so on. It was written about in the Times and so on. And I remember this story. This had nothing to do with your question, but I thought you might be interested. Sadie, my Aunt Sadie, my mother's sister, was, by the way, a beautiful lady. spoke Yiddish beautifully. Oh God, oh, I love Yiddish. You have no idea how wonderful Yiddish is. You know, that night that I played at Skirville, a woman came over to me and said, 120 year. What she was saying is, you should live to be 120. That is the legendary years that Moses lived. So whenever a child is born, they say 120. Okay? And two women came in who said that to me in Yiddish. Oh, that was just, yeah, it was a wonderful moment. But that, yeah, I've had many moments, but that moment of suddenly realized the audience was applauding me playing this piece that I was frightened to death to play. That gave me unbelievable power. Yeah. My name is Fred Katz, and this is my story, my own Geschichte.
You're a beautiful man, Fred.
Wow.